I'm Mark Van Ness, founder of Real Leaders, here for a real hot fireside chat with two of my favorite ethical finance leaders, Erika Karp, the founder and CEO of Cornerstone Capital Group, and Margret Trilli, the CEO and CIO of ImpactAssets. Both here to share some ideas on real leadership in times of crisis. And we have many crises to choose from in 2020, don't we? If you would like to go deeper on this issue, I have a gift for the ethical finance community. It's a digital copy of our fall edition of Real Leaders that includes our crisis leadership playbook, guaranteed to make you eager to lead through the next big crisis. You just can't wait, right? Just go to real-leaders.com/finance for your free copy. Now, we are nearly a year into this pandemic, and 32% of us think that, and I'm going to quote this from Aon, it is a one-time event that should not change how businesses like ours should prepare for the future. Really? That's a third of us are feeling that way. That is what Aon recently found in a survey of 800 executives of companies in the EU and US with over 500 employees minimum in an effort to evaluate post-pandemic risks. Fortunately, the survey also found that 2 out of 3 of us think the pandemic exposed new risks and vulnerabilities that require a significant change in how our business thinks about the future. But this demonstrates, I think, the difference between how a manager reacts to a crisis by expecting and hoping for a return to the way we were, and how a real leader responds by reimagining what could be. So today we're going to address those 3 distinct phases of the leadership action related to crisis. Before a crisis, during a crisis, and after a crisis. So since you already have their bios, I thought a good way to help you get to know Erika and Margret is to ask each to address what initiatives are you leading over the next 12 months that you're most excited about? And who wants to take on the first one? Erika, okay. I saw your hand go up, right?
Like, I'm the kid who's, sitting in the back of the class and you're calling me on me anyway.
That's why I call on you, because otherwise you'll misbehave.
Okay, that's right. And by the way, cheers to everybody. So, there's so many things that I'm excited about right now in terms of the initiatives at Cornerstone. And there's also so many, fears, and there's so much urgency. I mean, let's go back to the idea of crisis. So right at this very moment, we have a climate crisis, we have an economic crisis, we have a terrible health crisis, we have a racial equity crisis, we have a political crisis, we have a crisis of confidence. And this confluence of crises is frankly astonishing and certainly unprecedented. And so I guess the initiative that I'm most excited about is the work that we do to engage everyone in the idea of impact investing. And when I say that, I mean intentional and measurable work to align your money, your assets with your values, and again, create a better world. And another thing, I didn't mention, one of the crises we're in the midst of is a crisis of capitalism. And so when I say that, notwithstanding how messed up capitalism is right now, it remains the best system the world has ever known for driving prosperity, but it's really messed up. And by the way, right now, we're at the 50th year from Milton Friedman saying that corporations exist to increase their profits and serve their shareholders. Well, the problem with that, the real problem, is he did not say in the long term. And so short-termism and the ignoring externalities has really messed us up. And if we go back to Adam Smith, in the beginning of really modern economic thought, Adam Smith, even before The Wealth of Nations, talked about the theory of moral sentiments. We should, and we do, human beings care about how others in our species are doing. We care about their welfare. Well, we're not acting that way. And so for us, moving impact investment, the discipline of environmental, social, and governance analysis, moving that forward, letting everyone engage, is to me, that's why Cornerstone was built. So again, a lot of work to do to move trillions of dollars towards impact.
Great. Margret.
Well, I wish I'd gone first. That was great, Erika. Thank you for having me. So ImpactAssets is a nonprofit impact investing firm, and we, like Cornerstone, exist to further the adoption of impact investing. But we also we run a number of programs for philanthropists around impact investing, and we support grant making and impact investing across the whole spectrum, from concessionary investing to market rate investing. And one of the more exciting things we're working on now really was an opportunity that we actually didn't see it as an opportunity at the moment. We saw it as sort of a moral responsibility in the middle of this crisis. In the middle of the crisis, we stood up a number of charitable funds, and I can talk about those a little more later. But we're really taking that foray into charitable funds to beyond COVID into other thematic areas. And what's unique about our charitable funds is those charitable funds, they take in grants and recoverable grants, and they also they send out grants like all other charitable funds. But the majority of the purpose of these charitable funds is to do impact investing, which means when those dollars are returned, they get recycled again. And they go out again on multiple tours of duty. And the best example we have of this is a program that we did that took an initial tranche of $12 million intended for small business loans. Over the 5-year period, that $12 million did $63 million in lending to 500,000 people. And it is really astonishing how much, when you're recycling that capital, how much more work those dollars can have, and how much more work they can do, and how much more impact they can have. And so we're really excited to take our innovative charitable funds into new thematics, into new areas, and to engage with our clients and our collaborators across the space to do this in a new and different way.
Love the concept of recycling the capital.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to leadership before a crisis. And really what I'd like you to share are just any leadership moves you made before 2020 that positioned you to weather this storm more effectively.
So I know this is going to sound, a little hokey, but I genuinely feel like my entire life leading up to the current confluence of crises was part of how you prepare. You prepare kind of constitutionally as a human being. I'll give you an example. Well, by the way, varsity sports, I think that's one example. Yeah, but in college as an undergrad, I studied economics, and I was at Wharton. Everybody's studying finance, but I studied economics, and the reason I did that is because I was looking for a foundation. And economics gives you foundational thinking, systems-based thinking, which is critically important when we're facing complex problems and crises. And I'm going to give you a quote from Winston Churchill. He's standing in front of, the Parliament after it was destroyed and smoking. And Churchill said that we build our buildings, and thereafter they build us. So think about that, infrastructure. And it's incredibly important to have a strong infrastructure when you're going into a crisis. And I would suggest that infrastructure is the same as it's part of governance. We can make that an analogy. So when we talk about ESG analysis, I would tell you that the governance is first among equals. And given the crises that we are in right now, right, if you don't have good governance, if you haven't thought about environmental and social issues already, well, actually, by definition, you don't have good governance, right? And so I think that it is a lifetime of learnings, and the idea of building an infrastructure of, hopefully of wisdom and of experience. That is what you need going into a crisis. Again, for me, it's the crisis of capitalism that I am working to heal, because I think that it has great power. It's like what Margret talked about. We're talking about creating an economic multiplier effect, and that's how you get growth. So again, I think it's everything you do and everything you learn leading into current crisis.
Makes sense. Margret?
I couldn't agree more. I do think there is, I think the longer in the tooth you are, when a crisis hits, the more prepared you are, because you've seen it in prior cycles. You've amassed experiences along the way. I think the best thing we did at ImpactAssets, again, it was accidental. Nobody could have seen, the confluence of all these crises, happening this year. But we are a nonprofit. We have an earned revenue model, but we also rely quite a bit on operating grants to cover our expenses, a good portion of our expenses. And so as we were contemplating a growth strategy, just like every startup, we were having to expand our expenses and our headcount in order to spend into growth. And in the process of getting comfortable with that, we had to do a whole lot of modeling around what are the drivers of our revenue? What are the drivers of our expenses? If we weren't able to fundraise to cover those gaps, which we were intentionally growing, what would the levers be that we pull, and how would we model that out? And we knew where all the growth was coming down to in terms of which products and what types of clients, and we knew exactly what levers we would pull from an expense perspective if the market were to turn in the middle of a growth strategy, or any sort of exogenous factors had come in, and we'd caught ourselves in a position where we had higher expenses when we were expecting growth and didn't get it. So we were really prepared. We had our playbook. I don't think every business does that kind of modeling and planning, and we just happened to have been in a position where our strategic planning cycle had us just complete that with our board in the fourth quarter of last year. It's been tremendously helpful having that. But that said, we threw our strategic plan out the window when the crisis hit, and we had to completely reboot, because as with all crises or doomsday scenarios, all the modeling in the world only makes you feel prepared. There's no way you can model for the scenario that actually happens. And so you really do have to adapt right in the moment. And I think that's, again, to Erika's points, it's having a lot of experience and a lot of good counsel around you that really helps you to make those quick decisions and those pivots in the time when it matters most.
That's very consistent with that Aon survey I was mentioning earlier, because what they were saying is you can't really predict what the next crisis will be. Typically, it's not the one you planned for, but the companies, the teams that planned for risk, that really planned for that, they fared better coming through this crisis than those that hadn't had plans. And like you said, those plans didn't necessarily work, but I think maybe it's just a mindset of expecting the unexpected and being prepared for that. So that's good. So I'm going to stick with you here for a minute, and Margret, and ask kind of what moves do you wish you had made before 2020 that would have made this just smooth sailing, if that's even possible?
Yeah, because we'd done all that modeling, I felt really prepared. I don't know if there's anything I would have done, and my decision-making framework is more about it's constantly about like you make the decisions you can with the information you have, fully expecting, that you'll need to pivot. And every decision we make, we're thinking about, we identify in that moment, what are the things that would change our conviction to this decision? What are we watching for? What kind of market drops? What kind of market changes? What kind of client sentiment would we be looking for? What kind of feedback would we be listening for from our employees? Those types of things are feeding into when is it time to reevaluate a decision. And I have a much more rolling philosophy. So I don't expect to get it right or to ever be completely prepared or have seen everything. I think the job of great leaders, or at least my philosophy on leadership, is to set yourself up to constantly evaluate and be ready to not be so convicted to a decision that you want it to be right, but that you make a decision with the information you have, fully expecting that the environment will change or more information will become available and ready to evolve and pivot and adjust as the eventualities play out.
Well said. Erika, what moves do you wish you had made that would have made this a smoother year?
Well, the truth is, I feel very fortunate. I feel we were in a position to do what we needed to do. One of the reasons is that, Cornerstone is kind of built to think about future trends and investing for innovation and investing to deal with, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That's why we were built. So when I look back and I think, okay, coming into the crisis, what were the big trends, right? So we had a big trend in distance learning, big trend in telecommuting, big trend in e-health, right? Trends in inclusive finance, trends in working towards climate action and the next economy. So what is happening in this crisis before our eyes, and exponentially, these trends have accelerated, right? So in that sense, having thought about the trends before, we're positioned to actually, be even more active. And I will tell you, we are more busy in our fundamental primary business than we've ever been. And another thing, we talked about the initiatives that we're most excited about. Another is that we've created an impact measurement framework. All right, it's called the Access Impact Framework. And I'm so excited about this because we are able to take the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are so big, no poverty, no hunger. We're able to take these goals and actually make them investable, looking through a lens of access, right? So if you need, if you are totally focused on, let's say, women's economic empowerment, which, by the way, you can't separate from climate action, right? They're linked. Well, if you want to achieve women's economic empowerment, then you need access to capital, access to water, access to health, access to education, right? So if you look at these sustainable development goals through the lens of access, it makes them achievable and it makes them intuitive. And so this Access Impact Framework, we think, is a hugely important contribution to the field in terms of making impact investing understandable. And so, that's a big initiative. And I think, I wouldn't say there's anything I would have done differently. One thing we have done is we have stayed married to our strategic plan. And that is harder right now. That is a lot harder to not say, I'm going to do something else in response. I do this. We've got our strategic plan. We believe in it. We're sticking with it. It's harder to do in this environment, but we feel pretty strongly about that. And of course, the basic stuff. We had a really strong business continuity plan. We didn't miss a beat serving our clients when we started online. We've been very thoughtful about when people come back. So I feel very proud of my colleagues for, how we've managed this.
One of the things that I've found is when you go through a crisis, the the opportunity exists to do things that you could never have done without the crisis. And they say never waste a good crisis. And actually this event is a good example of that. Normally we'd all be flying all over the world to come together physically, and think about the carbon footprint, think about the cost, think about the time, and we're doing it in a much more efficient and environmentally friendly way now by this event, the way we're structuring it. So I think that's something good to keep in mind. And what comes to mind for me is the Great Recession, 10 years ago, the moves I made at that time in terms of really restructuring the business model I was operating under from a high fixed overhead expense model to a very high variable expense model made all the difference. At that time, it took 2.5 years to stabilize the ship. This time, it took 2 months. So really, if we look at the opportunity in any crisis, I think, and say, what can we do now that's going to make the difference the next time we get a jolt to the system? And when I started my career, I thought, they were one-time events. Like I was in that 1/3, I think, of this survey. And as I've had more experience with this, I realized, crises they're just part of leadership. I mean, that's going, and actually they're the greatest opportunities to lead is during the crisis. When that's not present, it's more of a management role. I think we often serve, and the crisis, I think, if we look at it as opportunity, it really changes the way we approach all this. So let's move on now to now we're in it, right? The leadership during the crisis. So what have you done? I'd like to really address what you've done to lead your staff through the pandemic and the economic upheaval and all the things that we're facing, and what have you done either this year or in past crises to lead your clients through a crisis? Because both are very important, and they're actually interconnected.
So I can tell you a little story if you want.
Sure, we love stories.
Yeah, sometimes your crisis is not that of your client, but it might be visible to your client. This is a little story. I was at a large firm, that had a number of crises internally going on. So it's the financial services industry. So, we had the, Great Recession, and there's, issues around the street on LIBOR, and there's issues around, trading and, some bad things going on Wall Street, right? So I remember one morning, it was about 5 a.m, and I was getting dressed to run to the airport to go somewhere. And it was interesting because the meeting I was about to have was with the head of governance at a particular asset manager. And I woke up, I go to get dressed, I turn on Bloomberg, and what I saw was giant headlines about like a breakdown in, governance at my own firm. And I'm about to go to the airport to talk about, governance with the client. And so, I was able to find out the basics of what had happened, but it was not good. And the whole flight there, I'm like, how am I going to approach this? Going in to talk about governance, and my own firm is having big issues, big public issues. So what I decided to do, and this is, today it affects you, is I decided to be very transparent and very honest, about what I knew, what had happened. And, we just had this honest conversation. And the most interesting part of it is in this conversation, the client was actually, concerned about the relationship between, my firm and his. He was actually concerned about the health of my firm because it mattered to his firm. And it was just such an interesting, honest, transparent conversation that we actually ended up, having a stronger and closer relationship because we shared this crisis together. And there was a little impact on him, but it was a lot of impact on me. And so it was really important. It was an important lesson. So instead of my saying, yeah, everything's fine, I was like, yeah, this is what's going on and this is how it feels. And we talked. And so the reason I use that as an example is because, I think that during a crisis, in the midst of a crisis, you have to be as transparent as you can possibly be, as kind of pragmatic about what's going on, what has gone on, what's going to go on. And I think that's the way you deal with it as a leader. And you don't also, one of the jobs I think is to keep people really engaged and know everything they need to know. Let them know the bad stuff, the downside. But at the same time, the energy associated with dealing with it, they have to feel that too. It can't just be all bad. Now, there's a couple of situations that I've been in that is really all bad. I remember precisely where I was standing and what I was doing on 9/11. I remember every second of it. And that is all bad. But I have to tell you, the way the United States and the way our financial markets dealt with that, it was extraordinary. We were proud to be Americans. It was amazing the way the stock markets opened up as quickly as they did. And I remember how my firm behaved, and I was so proud. So in that case, it's pretty much all bad, but you can still take control of the situation. Transparency, honesty, and humanity, I would add to that. So just a couple examples.
Margret.
You ready for me? Okay. So in this crisis, we really had a very similar philosophy to yours, Erika. We sort of centered on 4 key tenets to keep in mind as a leadership team: hope, transparency, stability, and trust. And we measured ourselves in any action or decision we were making or delaying against those 4 things to try to make sure that we were providing those things to our people. That's what people need from leadership in a crisis. And sometimes those are at odds. If we're needing to model doomsday scenarios or multiple scenarios on our finances, sharing all of those with everyone, it is really unnerving and destabilizing. And it is really the burden of management to worry about those things. But the team does need to know and have confidence in leadership to handle and lead the firm through whatever may be. So there's a delicate balance between stability and hope and transparency that I found challenging, and especially in this crisis. The way we responded internally to leading our people, some specifics were we because people were struggling with remote work, like the mental health issues of it, but also in the beginning there was this real sense that I can't wait for things to get back to normal, and we had to do quite a bit of work to signal in many ways, in multiple ways, that this is going to be with us for a while. And if whatever is happening for you at home or your work at home situation is not working for you, we need to figure out a way to get it to good. And so we started having these conversations one-off, and then we started doing pulse surveys, and we continue to do them through the crisis to measure things like, how are things going at your work from home situation? At some point, we had to get specific about, do you have a monitor? Do you have a keyboard? Do you have reliable internet? Because, yes or no, or, rated on a 5-point scale wasn't granular enough. And we were still finding that people didn't have monitors or were struggling with their work setup. But we were also asking questions about, do you have confidence in leadership? And, how are you feeling? And in every time those surveys went out, we were including the numbers to the hotlines on mental health and all the things that our healthcare program provided to people for emotional and mental health support. Just trying to stay, keep tabs on all of that. And the one problem we haven't been able to really solve for, because it's bigger than just us, is the folks who have small children at home who are in and out of school, and they don't have ample childcare situations, and things are in various states of opening up here across the company. And it's just been, the most we can do there is just give people, as Erika said, a ton of compassion and let them know that they have the stability of their job, and we're going to work with them through whatever situation they have around their availability, and really providing, that comfort for them, enabled them to be open with us and to build trust around really being honest about what's happening there. We also had the added challenge of, as we serve philanthropists and impact investors through this crisis, and I mentioned earlier how our earned revenue situation only covers part of our expenses. We also found ourselves in a situations where not only is the market crashing, and our philanthropists, of course, are going to be focused on other things, but not only that, but they are uber active now, trying to support their investments. So they're re-upping in their current investments. They're doing more grant making. Our grants volume is up 400%. And we beat our annual record for impact investments in June of this year. So we already do a lot of investments. Last year we did 150 private investments in private funds and private companies. And we passed that record already this year. We've surpassed it in dollars even sooner. So our teams were, at the same time, struggling with availability because they have small kids at home, and facing volumes that are just not humanly possible. So we ended up hiring temporary help, temporary workforce to come in and support. We had to restructure and reorganize everybody's workloads and work days so that we could push down a lot of the easy to teach work to the temporary workforce. We have something like 6 or 9 of them on staff, and we're ramping up now to get through our busy season, which is basically started in the middle of March. So we really had a huge leadership challenge from a management of staff perspective, and it took really staying close to everybody, a finger on the pulse with everybody in the organization to really evolve a strategy throughout to address hope, transparency, stability, and trust.
Well, I can't help but think if it was built, each of you are describing this, that America is probably the best example in the world in terms of how we dealt with the current crisis of like the leadership moves that you probably should do the opposite of. It's.
I was worried about where you were going with that.
Well, I saw Erika's face.
Like, what? We're friends, right?
Yeah. But really, I mean, you got to look at what's positive about what's going on, and it's just such a good example of the downside to getting this wrong. And in this case, it's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of human lives by getting it wrong and not having that trust. And the latest thing I read on the potential for a vaccine is that only a third of Americans trust enough to take that vaccine if it does arrive. So it doesn't really solve the problem. So these kind of things, I think it's good to study what people are doing right, but I think we can learn as much from what people are getting wrong. And it's just it's not the place that any country wants to be number one. But what you're describing is the right way. Yeah, so thank you. Well, let's move on to after a crisis, but it's over, right? And my first question on this is really like, how do you know when it's over? I mean, sometimes they drag on and it's, you have improvement, but it's not like really over. And other times there's a more finite ending to it. But how do you judge when a crisis is actually over?
So I would suggest that a crisis is actually never over. It really isn't. It's how you transition from a crisis, right? And so these days, when we talk about racial injustice, we have clients that specifically want to figure out, how do we invest for progress in racial equity? How do we invest for progress on, women's economic empowerment? And certainly, how do we invest for climate? And so in each of these cases, we're talking about a transition, capitalism too, right? So the question is, as leaders, how can we create a just transition, right? So when we talk about climate, and so, there's 60,000 coal jobs that we're going to lose. They're effectively going to be gone, right? But we're going to create millions of jobs in alternative energies. So that's good, but we can't forget about the coal workers. And so in a just transition, we're thinking about engaging everybody in the decision-making process. Let everyone have, power and be engaged. And so I think that that's the way it kind of is with every crisis. Have we learned how to engage everybody? And the idea with impact investing, right? We want to create a global economy that is more regenerative and more inclusive. And so the many crises that we're in the midst of will give us a chance to do that into the future. It's kind of a continuum. So let's go back to the idea of, social justice, racial equity. It's a continuum in that sometimes, you have these organizations that are just simply racist and exclusionary. And then on this continuum, we move towards organizations that are more thoughtful. And maybe it's just, a compliance headset, for them. And that's a start. But then we go towards a proactive organization, on further. And then we end up on this continuum, hopefully, with multicultural, anti-racist organizations that are thinking. So coming out of a crisis, I think like that, it's a continuum. But that idea of a just transition, and again, not just with climate action, but throughout multiple crises, I think it's what's really, really important. And I think about also, when it comes to the future, what are we leaving to the next generation? Are we good stewards of capital? And I mean financial capital, human capital, natural capital, right? What is our legacy as we go from generation to generation? There's a term, a Hebrew term, lador vador, from generation to generation. So, crises give us the opportunity to think that way,
Well said.
Yes. Well, I think for us, the crisis set us off in a new trajectory, and I don't think there's any going back from on the trajectory that we're on, and it's a better trajectory than the one we thought we were going to be on in January. As the crisis hit, our clients were coming to us asking, what do we do? How do we play? Where do we give? How do we invest? And what are the critical gaps? And we set off for the first time to really take a leadership position. We'd seen all of our clients have very different impact strategies. They care about climate change, education, ages 0 to 3, and investing in entrepreneurs in my metropolitan area. And that's their impact strategy. And we have to, cobble together, an investment strategy around that. It's very bespoke. And we do, 80% of our assets are in the private market. So it's very, very different setup. But for the first time, all of our clients cared about one thing, and that was, how do I respond in COVID? And how do I address this big systemic issue? And like so many other analyses we do, we had to set out and in this very evolving fluid situation, figure out what a sufficient response looks like at the macro level and map where is government responding and what are they funding? What is the private sector funding? And where are the critical gaps that aren't getting funded? And that is the role of philanthropy, and that's the role of impact investors. And that's where we got to work. And we started, whether the topic was testing or therapeutics or vaccinations or PPE or any of the other health services and health delivery responses, we got to work to figure out what's not getting funded. And we built strategies around that. And the sad but not surprising outcome is that critical gap, regardless of topic, almost always came down to distribution and access. And it's the same communities, low-income communities, communities of color, rural communities, that are left out of the solutions that are being funded by government and funded by the private sector. We need solutions that are available, portable, with extreme affordability. And those solutions are not getting funded by big pharma. They're not getting funded by our government right now. And there are opportunities for generics, for example, which aren't going to make the big pharma companies a lot of money, but the safety profile is known, and they've been in market working on other applications for decades. Those are, all they needed to be doing is just be trialed and tested on the efficacy against COVID. And then they're in market with a really, proven safety profile. Those aren't getting funded. So there's an opportunity for philanthropists and impact investors to really step up, get a great financial return, and also have an enormous impact on the gaps in certainly the U.S. response, but also with global applications as well, especially when you get to testing and some of the other ubiquitous needs across the globe. So, our work has really been in digging in and serving our clients with strategies around those areas. And that's where this concept of the charitable fund was born for us. We have a charitable fund that's set up around the specific health response for our frontline heroes and stopping the spread of COVID. We have another charitable fund set up to help our clients ensure that we preserve the progress on social and environmental crises, including climate change and social equity. And we have a third fund that does small business lending and lending to individuals who are typically left out of our banking systems. And we, after this, intend to take on things like fires and forest maintenance and climate change and racial equity and all of the things that are top of mind for our clients now, with that really unique structure that I described in the beginning, with a fund that takes grants and recoverable grants and deploys them through impact investments and recycles the capital. So we're super excited about the trajectory that we're on. And I don't expect that there will be an after the crisis shift on that trajectory. The crisis just simply knocked us onto a different course. And I think it's a better one. And there is sometimes opportunity in crisis, and we certainly felt that way.
Well, you two are giving me hope. I really, really appreciate everything you're doing, and it's exciting that there's a lot of people doing great work. And unfortunately, we're toward the end of our time. I'd love to spend another hour with you, but we'll do that at another time. I made notes of just kind of 3 nuggets from this that I'll share, and if you have anything to add to wrap it up, feel free. But the first takeaway for me was kind of a different way of looking at it. There's lead as if the crisis is never over. I like that, because it does create opportunities that don't exist when there is no crisis, but it also keeps the urgency there, which is important. The second one I had was crises are their biggest opportunities to lead. And finally, do the opposite of what America did in the pandemic. Any final words you'd like to share?
So
The
I'm
only
gonna
thing
go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Erika.
I'm going to wrap up with a quote. And so I'm not going to get, political, but you can imagine my thoughts these days. But it's an important quote. It's actually from Exupéry, Antoine, in Le Petit Prince. And I think it's so interesting. He wrote, if you want to build a ship, you don't gather up people and send them out there to gather wood and hammers and everything else. You show people the vast expanse of the sea, right? And I think that is so beautiful because it's going to take internal, fortitude and real engagement to get done what we need to get done. So it is the vast expanse of the sea that motivates me.
That's really beautiful.
It takes all of us.
Yes.
No one
Well,
can really have much impact, but all of us can have huge impact. Margret.
Well, the only thing I'll add to that is I do think this year has presented us with crisis after crisis after crisis, and it is unprecedented. And I think our response as individuals, as foundations, as philanthropists, as investors, as people has to be different. And I think we all need to be asking ourselves the question about what trajectory should we all be on, and not expect to stay or try to get back to where we were, but how do we come together as people to address this current crisis? It's not over. It's not going to be over anytime soon. And at least here in the States, and I know there's other geographies with the same challenges, philanthropy and impact investing will play a critical role in getting through this. And so I do think the challenge or the call to action I would have for everyone is to really understand what your role will be, and to expect to continue to be working at it with all of us to get through.
Beautiful. Well, please join me in saying thank you to Margret Trilli and Erika Karp for sharing your experience and wisdom with us today, and for all your great work. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Applause.
Machines or something.
We'll talk to you all soon.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.